This is part 2 of the Firearms and Fantasy series that I am doing here on Sebastian's Cauldron. Last video, we talked about a few things to consider before implementing firearms in your fantasy tabletop role-playing game. That was a pretty setting-specific world builders sort of video. Hey everyone, Sebastian here from Sebastian's Cauldron. Today we are going to talk a little more specifically about a few different game systems that you might want to consider using if you're trying to include guns. We're going to take a little tour of 4 different game systems that I have found, researched, or played that include guns in some way, shape, or form. Now, we have quite a few options for what you can use. I'm only using 4 examples because these 4 are the ones that I think are most closely resembling the sort of fantasy tabletop role-playing game that everyone's going to want to know and love. They are probably the more popular options that you could find. There are quite a few. There's a lot of TTRPGs that I was able to find online that had guns in some way. A lot of them either very obscure, very old, or very new and sort of not really well known. I wanted to include things that I was either going to be comfortable running and thus recommending, or ones that I've personally run and used, and so I feel confident talking about them. I did find quite a few really interesting systems, quite a few interesting mechanics and different games, all sorts of stuff that there's a whole world out there outside of sort of just Dungeons and Dragons. Because of this, I might not mention your favorite role-playing game, and if so, I'm sorry, I'm not saying that they're bad, these are ones that I feel are most connected to what we're trying to talk about, which is firearms and fantasy. The first system I want to talk about is called GURPS. GURPS, also known as the Generic Universal Role-Playing System. It's a system that first came out in 1985 and is now up to its 4th edition, which was released in 2004. As the title of it suggests, it's a pretty generic universal system made and designed to cater for a wide variety of scenarios, from fantasy to western to cyberpunk to zombies and everything in between. It is stupidly versatile and probably one of the best blank canvases for any GM to try and use to create the game of their choice. Unlike a lot of modern TTRPGs that people play and familiar with, GURPS makes use exclusively of the D6, 6-sided dice. It doesn't use any of the other 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 20, it just uses D6s, which means it might be a little more accessible for people. I know a big sticking point for a few RPGs is just getting confused between all of the different dice. Now, GURPS has a crazy amount of expansions, a crazy amount of different options. Because of this, some people say that it's very front-loaded. It's going to take you a while to create a character, probably a few hours. I know that personally in D&D, I can build up a character in probably 15 minutes or so. Once you get the stats, it's just a matter of going down basically a checklist, equipment, etc., etc. GURPS is going to take you a little bit more time. As I said, there's a crazy amount of expansion. A lot of them include guns. GURPS goes for a very realistic sort of depiction of what a firearm battle is going to be, in that they are very deadly and it's not going to take very long. In theory, GURPS can be applied to any sort of genre. Obviously, fantasy would work. You can whack guns on top of that and it should be fine. GURPS is something I have not personally played. It looks very interesting. I'd really like to run it at some point, but that is my first recommendation if you're trying to include guns in a fantasy RPG. You're going to have to do a little bit of work. There's a lot of reading. You're going to have to do a lot of mechanics, but it's incredibly detailed. It's very noodly. I think it's everything that you could possibly want if you're looking for a more simulationist style game. The next system I want to talk about is Savage Worlds. Savage Worlds is a similarly generic system like GURPS, but it tries to emphasize quick and easy play, less preparation than typical RPGs, focus being able to just sit down and get through some stuff. Awesome. Like D&D, it uses multiple dice from the D4 to the D12. Unlike D&D, it does not use a D20 to resolve skill checks and everything. Instead, you have different traits and different ranks in said traits. This would be sort of similar to, ability scores and all that. So instead of having a set number, you have a die. So if you were building a character that was meant to be very strong, but not very smart, you would perhaps have the highest die rank in strength, which would be a D12, and the lowest die rank in your smart trait, which would be a D4. When you then make a skill check using your strength, you would roll the D12, add some other modifiers, and that is your end result. If you were rolling rolling with your smart, you would use the D4, add any modifiers, and go from there. It's got some really interesting combat mechanics. It does away with traditional RPG hit points and instead relies on a toughness trait and then a series of conditions to show that you are shaken, wounded, and then incapacitated. It means that characters and enemies alike are going to be very quickly taken out of combat. It means that combat in Savage Worlds, before you even add on Firearms, is going to be very deadly, very quick, and very fast-paced. The Firearms have been pretty well balanced from what I can gather. There seems to be a decent balance between using Firearms in ranged combat versus using traditional melee weapons. As I said, the combat's going to be fast anyway, so no matter which one you're picking, it's going to be over quick. Now, Savage Worlds itself, similar to GURPS, is a generic system. People build games on top of it. There are also different settings and whatnot that you can use. A couple that I really personally like the sound of are Deadlands Reloaded, which is a sort of weird west sort of setting. It's not quite fantasy, but it's close. And the other one being the Powder Mage RPG is built off of Savage Worlds, which I really want to try. It looks really cool. I really like Powder Mages. The next one we're going to talk about is Pathfinder, because we are talking about fantasy tabletop role-playing games. Of course, we are going to talk about Pathfinder. Pathfinder started off as a house-ruled D&D 3.5 edition, which then developed into its own new game. Because of this, Pathfinder has sat in a sort of strange spot in relation to D&D. Pathfinder itself, the first edition, was released in 2009, with the Ultimate Combat book coming out in 2011, introducing us to the gunslinger and to the firearms rules. And then we had second edition be released in 2019, and the Guns and Gears playtest was released just a few weeks ago in 2021. Now, Pathfinder is well known because of its inclusion of firearms, and this is because of a couple of reasons. One, they've been a sort of controversial topic of discussion when people talk about Pathfinder, but two, the inclusion of Percival Friedrichshain von Musa-Kowalski de Roller III in Critical Role sort of exploded the popularity of the gunslinger in D&D and also in Pathfinder. Matt Mercer spent a lot of time trying to port over the gunslinger from Pathfinder into 5th edition, and he did a commendable job. I reckon it works pretty well. Of course, going from any one system to another, trying to do any sort of conversion, it is difficult to do. Mercer himself is a fantastic DM, but he's not a game designer, so it's not going to be perfect, but I think it's decent. Now, the guns in Pathfinder I have actually spent a little time looking at, so I can talk about them in a little more detail. Firearms will typically resolve their attacks against an enemy or player's touch AC, which is basically their armor class without armor. This sort of helps represent how firearms generally punch through armor pretty easily and why armor sort of stopped being used when firearms became more popular. They do a decent amount of damage, they have a nice critical range. Most of the firearms in Ultimate Combat have an either ×3 or ×4 to their criticals, which is pretty cool. You're going to be doing a lot of damage. In order to balance that out, Pathfinder introduced the misfire mechanic, which is again one of the more controversial mechanics that have been used for firearms in an RPG. A misfire is going to occur when your natural attack roll, that is the unmodified number that comes up on the dice, is equal or lower than the misfire score of the weapon. So a pepper box, for example, is going to have a misfire score of 1 to 2, meaning if you rolled a natural 1 or a natural 2, that weapon has misfired. There's a couple of caveats depending on a few gunslinger class abilities, some feats, etc., but generally a misfire is going to result in your firearm becoming broken. If it is an early weapon, such as the pepper box or a musket or a flintlock pistol, a second misfire is going to cause that weapon to explode. If it's a more advanced, more modern firearm, it's not going to explode, it's just going to stay broken, which means it's going to be harder to use. Damn. As I said, Pathfinder is built on D&D 3.5 edition. It's going to seem both very familiar and very different if you're coming to it from 5th edition D&D, but it is pretty interesting. There's a lot of very detailed mechanics. It's going in the opposite direction of 5th edition, in my opinion, which is a lot of stuff that the GM would typically have to make up themselves in 5th edition is included and written down as rules in Pathfinder. I think it's pretty interesting. It's certainly more complicated than 5th edition D&D, but it is less complicated than Savage Worlds. You might notice that I'm sort of declining down in terms of complications and how noodly the mechanics are and everything. The last one we're going to talk about, because of course this is a D&D channel, we are going to talk about D&D, 5th edition specifically, because that is the most popular version that is out at the moment. Firearms in 5th edition have been sort of strange. There are optional rules that are included in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which include Renaissance weapons such as a flintlock pistol and a musket rifle, to more modern weapons including semi-automatic pistols, hunting rifles, and even sci-fi weapons like the laser pistol and the antimatter rifle. The weapons included there are okay, they're high damage, they have the loading property, which means if you're a martial character and you have extra attack, that is irrelevant because you can only shoot it once per round. There's no misfire or anything. The loading property acts as a way to balance the sort of high damage that you're going to be outputting. In the latest D&D sourcebook, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, they included a feat called Gunner, which allows you to ignore the loading property of firearms. It's an interesting set of weapons, it's an interesting feat that they've included. I haven't made up my mind on whether I like it or not. A lot of 5th edition homebrew of Firearms includes several mechanics borrowed from other games, such as the reload score, which requires you to reload the weapon using an action or bonus action or some other increment of time. And typically the misfire mechanic is used, which again, in D&D, I'm not sure if I'm a fan of. I know that one solution that often comes up when people are talking about firearms in D&D is to simply reflavor bows and crossbows as different firearms. And it would work, I think, it would work better in a more commonplace gun setting, so you don't have to worry about the guns trying to be unique or anything. I think if you're doing an emerging or a very rare campaign that someone wanted to be the inventor of firearms, you'd probably want something a little more interesting, a little more different from just a standard, oh, it's just a bow, but it's a gun. Easy, done. So those are 4 different systems that you might consider using if you want to include guns in your role-playing game, in your story. I think they're all really interesting. I'd love to try and run them all at some point. I'm doing Pathfinder soon. I'm going to be looking at Savage Worlds in a little more detail, probably in the next year or so. And GURPS, I think, it seems intimidating to me. And I'm not sure if I'll get around to doing it, but I think on paper, it sounds really cool. In the next video in this series, we will talk about some 5e homebrew that I have found, that I use my own sort of rules and stuff, and what I'm sort of using, enjoying, what I would recommend if you're wanting to put firearms into your D&D 5th edition campaign. Because there is a lot of it, and I've had to wade through a lot of questionable homebrew and my own questionable decisions as well when trying to figure out what I want to use. Spoiler alert for the next video, I think if I went back in time knowing what I knew now when I started my current campaign, I would definitely have some different rules for the firearms. But that's okay, we're gonna work with it. So that's the video. If you enjoyed, send this around, do all the usual YouTube stuff. You can subscribe. Apparently a lot of people are watching my videos but not subscribing. Come on. Just hit the button. The subscribe feed is usually pretty cluttered, so you may as well just add in another channel anyway. Come on, and hit the like button while you're down there as well. You can drop a comment if you found this interesting, if you're including guns in your game, if you're using a different system that I haven't mentioned, you can drop it all down there. You can click on other stuff that's going to appear in a few seconds, and I'll see you guys some other time.